I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened. I didn't stop believing in God, not once. Not even when the bones in my hands started breaking and resetting themselves under the full moon. Not even when I tasted blood for the first time and understood, truly understood, why the wolf hunts. God didn't leave me. I left humanity, and I did it on purpose. My name is Father Angelo Gillespie. I served as parish priest of St. Matthias Church in Calvary Hollow for 11 years. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible. I know that. I need you to listen anyway. Not because I need to be believed, because the people of that town, my people, my flock, deserve to have someone know what was done for them, even if they never find out themselves.
This recording was found in the basement of St. Matthias Church in the autumn of 2019. The church had been abandoned for 6 months. Dust covered the pews. The candles on the altar had burned to nothing and never been replaced. The only sign that anyone had been there at all was a tape recorder sitting on a box of water-damaged Christmas decorations, its red recording light still faintly glowing, as if it had been waiting for someone to come and listen. The man speaking is Father Angelo Gillespie, who served as parish priest of St. Matthias from 2007 to 2018. What follows is his account, pieced together from the tape, from parish records, from interviews with the remaining congregation members, and from 17 separate witness reports filed over the subsequent years, of what happened to his congregation, his church, and his body in the 14 months before St. Matthias closed its doors for the last time. Authorities have never confirmed or denied the contents of this tape. The diocese has declined to comment, and every Thursday evening someone in Calvary Hollow still leaves bread and wine at the tree line behind the church. No one has ever seen who takes it, but by morning, it's always gone. Chapter 1. The Shepherd. Calvary Hollow was the kind of town that didn't appear on GPS unless you already knew it was there. Tucked into a wrinkle of land between 2 ridges in the rural hill country, it had the look of a place that had once been something and was now mostly the memory of that something. The main street, and there was only one, ran for 6 blocks before giving up entirely and dissolving into a gravel road that wound into the woods. A hardware store, a diner that served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon because nobody came for lunch, a post office, a gas station with 2 pumps, one of which hadn't worked since the previous decade, and at the far end of the street, sitting on a slight rise like a grandmother watching her family from a porch chair, St. Matthias Church. The church was stone. Not the elegant cut stone of city cathedrals, the rough, stubborn field stone of a building that had been constructed by people who cared more about permanence than beauty. It had been built in 1903 by a congregation of 60, and in the 100-plus years since, it had survived 2 floods, a lightning strike that took the bell tower in 1947, and the slow economic exsanguination that had reduced Calvary Hollow from a thriving mill town of 800 to a quiet settlement of just under 200 souls, who remained for reasons that ranged from stubbornness to poverty to a bone-deep attachment to the land that defied rational explanation. The pews held 60. On a good Sunday, Easter, Christmas, the occasional funeral that drew people back from wherever they'd scattered to, they filled. On a normal Sunday, 30 faces looked up at Father Angelo Gillespie as he stood at the altar and delivered his homily with the unhurried warmth of a man who had nowhere else he'd rather be. He was not what people expected when they heard the word priest. Angelo Gillespie was 47 years old, built like someone who'd spent his youth doing physical labor before the seminary found him, broad-shouldered, thick-handed, with a face that had been weathered by wind and honesty into something that wasn't handsome but was better than handsome. It was trustworthy. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples in a way that made him look like he'd earned every silver strand individually. His eyes were brown, warm, and possessed of the specific quality that made people tell him things they hadn't planned to tell anyone. He'd come to Calvary Hollow in 2007, assigned by the diocese to a parish so small and so remote that the assignment was widely understood to be either a punishment or a test. It was neither. Angelo had requested it. He'd grown up in a town not unlike this one, a place where the church was the heartbeat and the priest was the man who kept it pumping, and he'd felt, with the quiet certainty that he attributed to divine guidance, that Calvary Hollow was where God needed him. 11 years later, the town agreed. He was the man who showed up at your door at 2 a.m. when your mother was dying and sat with you until dawn, not because he had answers, but because he believed that the presence of another human being in the dark was itself a form of prayer. He was the man who fixed the church roof himself after the last big storm, spending 3 days on a ladder with a bucket of tar and a stubbornness that the roofer in the next county said bordered on clinical. He was the man who ran the food bank out of the church basement every Wednesday, who hosted the AA meetings on Thursday nights, who taught the children's Bible study on Saturday mornings with a patience that suggested he'd been specifically engineered for the task. He knew every parishioner's name, their children's names, their dead parents' names. He knew that Eleanor Thomas, 83 and iron-willed, put exactly $1.37 in the collection plate every Sunday because that was what she could afford, and she'd sooner die than miss a week. He knew that Phil Hart, the hardware store owner, hadn't taken communion in 6 years because of a sin he'd confessed but never quite forgiven himself for. He knew that Lucia Bennett, who ran the diner, left the back door unlocked on cold nights so that anyone without a home could come in and sleep on the booths, and that she'd never once told anyone she did this because she believed that charity performed publicly wasn't charity at all. He loved them. Not abstractly, not theologically, not in the way that the word love appears in seminary textbooks as a concept to be studied and applied. He loved them the way you love family. Specifically, imperfectly, with full knowledge of their flaws and full commitment to showing up anyway. Calvary Hollow was his flock, and Angelo Gillespie was the kind of shepherd who didn't just feed his sheep. He stood between them and whatever came out of the dark. The first sign came in late September. Edgar Pitts, who ran a small cattle operation on 40 acres at the western edge of town, found 2 of his heifers dead in the lower pasture on a Monday morning. He'd lost livestock before. Coyotes were a fact of life in the hill country, and the occasional stray dog pack would take down a calf if the fencing wasn't maintained. But this was different. The heifers hadn't been eaten. They'd been torn apart, not savaged by a predator looking for a meal, dismantled, deliberately. The carcasses were spread across a 30-yard radius, and the pattern of the damage suggested something that killed not out of hunger, but out of something else entirely. The veterinarian from the county seat drove out, looked at what was left, and wrote, "Large predator, unknown species" on the report, because he didn't have a box to check for what he was actually thinking. Edgar brought it up at the Thursday night AA meeting, not because he had a drinking problem, but because the AA meeting had long since become the town's unofficial forum for things that needed discussing. He stood in the church basement with his hat in his hands and described what he'd found, and the room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when everyone present knows something they haven't said out loud yet. "It wasn't coyotes," Edgar said, "and it wasn't dogs. I've been ranching 30 years. I know what a predator kill looks like. This wasn't that. This was... I don't know what this was." Angelo listened from the back of the room. He didn't speak. He watched the faces of his parishioners and saw what Edgar's words were doing to them, not creating something new, but confirming something that had been accumulating in the town's collective awareness for weeks. Small things, and things that individually meant nothing but collectively formed a pattern that nobody wanted to be the first to name. Chester Grimes, who lived alone in a cabin at the north end of the hollow, mentioned that his dog had refused to go outside after dark for the past month. The animal, a large, fearless mutt that had once treed a black bear, now spent its nights pressed against the back wall of the cabin, whimpering. Hazel Melton said she'd seen something in the tree line behind her property. She'd been hanging laundry at dusk, later than she usually did, but the day had been warm and she'd wanted to take advantage of the last light, and she'd looked up and seen eyes. Not the green reflective flash of a deer caught in ambient light. These eyes were higher off the ground than any deer, and they were gold. "They were watching me," Hazel said, "not the way an animal watches, the way a person watches, like they were thinking about what they were seeing." The room was very quiet. Angelo walked home to the rectory that night, a small, drafty house attached to the back of the church that he'd made comfortable through sheer force of habitation rather than any actual renovation, and stood at his kitchen window looking out at the tree line that bordered the church property. The trees were black against a sky full of stars. Nothing moved, nothing watched, but the air felt different, charged, the way air feels before a storm that the weather hasn't predicted yet, a pressure change so subtle it registers not in the ears but somewhere deeper, in the animal part of the brain that humans have spent millennia learning to ignore. And Angelo pressed his hand to the window glass. It was cold, the woods were dark, the town was quiet, and somewhere out there in the space between the trees where the streetlights didn't reach and the road didn't go, something was waiting with the patience of a thing that had been waiting for a very, very long time. He didn't know that yet. He wouldn't know it for months, but standing at that window, with his palm flat against the glass and his breath fogging the view, Father Angelo Gillespie felt something he'd never felt in 11 years of serving this parish. He felt like prey. He pulled the curtain closed, made his tea, read his evening scripture, Psalm 23 as it happened, though he didn't choose it consciously. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." He closed the Bible, turned off the lamp, and in the dark of the rectory, in the quiet of Calvary Hollow, he whispered the prayer he said every night. "Lord, watch over this flock, and give me the strength to be the shepherd they need." He didn't know yet what that prayer would cost him. He would. Chapter 2. The Encroachment. October came to Calvary Hollow the way trouble comes to small towns, one bad day at a time. Edgar Pitts lost 4 more head of cattle in the second week. Then the Sullivan farm, 3 miles south, reported sheep missing. Not killed, just gone, as if they'd walked into the tree line and the trees had swallowed them. Derek Sullivan drove out to the pasture at dawn and found the fence pulled apart. Not broken by an animal pushing through it, pulled apart. The wire had been unwound from the posts with a precision that suggested fingers rather than teeth. He reported it to the sheriff's office in the county seat 22 miles away. A deputy drove out, looked at the fence, took photographs, and wrote up a report that attributed the damage to vandalism, likely juveniles. Derek stood in his pasture and watched the deputy drive away and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The county didn't understand Calvary Hollow. It never had. The town was too small to warrant attention and too quiet to generate the kind of crisis that forced people in suits to pay attention. Angelo visited Derek that afternoon, found him sitting on his porch with a rifle across his knees and a look on his face that the priest recognized, not from scripture or seminary, but from 11 years of sitting with people in crisis. It was the look of a man who had seen something he couldn't explain and was now rearranging his entire understanding of reality to accommodate it. "I heard them last night," Derek said, not looking at Angelo, looking at the tree line. "Not howling." "That's what I keep telling myself. They weren't howling. Wolves howl, dogs howl. These were talking to each other. In something that wasn't language but wasn't just noise either. It was organized. It had structure." He paused, swallowed. "Father, I've hunted these woods since I was 12 years old. I've heard every sound these hills make. That sound doesn't belong here." Angelo sat with him on the porch for 2 hours, didn't offer explanations, didn't minimize. He'd learned long ago that the most valuable thing a priest could do in the face of the unexplainable was simply to stay, to be the person who didn't leave when the story got strange. But when he drove home that evening, his hands were tight on the steering wheel, and the prayer he said under his breath wasn't the calm, measured prayer of a man in communion with his God. It was the clipped, urgent prayer of a man asking for instructions. "Lord, something is happening to my town. Tell me what to do." The silence that answered was vast and untroubled. The attacks on livestock continued through October and into November. They followed a pattern that Angelo plotted on a map he'd pinned to the wall of his study, a simple road map of Calvary Hollow and its surroundings, with red pins marking each incident. When he stepped back and looked at the pattern, his stomach dropped. The pins formed a circle, a slow, tightening circle with St. Matthias Church at its center. Whatever was out there wasn't hunting randomly, it was closing in. He brought the map to the Thursday meeting, spread it on the folding table in the church basement, and let the congregation see what he'd seen. So the room went quiet with the specific density of silence that happens when a group of people simultaneously arrive at a conclusion they've been individually resisting. "It's coming here," said Gladys Ryan, who was 71 and had the particular bluntness of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and no longer had patience for euphemism. "Whatever it is, it's coming to the church." "We don't know that," Angelo said, though he did know it. He knew it the way shepherds know weather, not through instruments but through the feel of the wind and the behavior of the flock. "Then why are the pins in a circle, Father?" Gladys replied, and there was no good answer to that, so Angelo didn't offer one. Bill Patterson, who ran the gas station and served as the closest thing Calvary Hollow had to a town council, suggested organizing night patrols. A few of the men agreed: Derek Sullivan, Edgar Pitts, Lewis Cox from the lumberyard. They'd take shifts driving the perimeter roads with rifles and spotlights, the way their fathers and grandfathers had done when coyote populations surged. They went out the first night. 4 trucks, 8 men. Enough firepower to handle anything the hill country had ever produced. They found nothing. No tracks, no scat, no sign of any animal large enough to tear apart a heifer or pull a fence to pieces. The woods were quiet, not the natural quiet of a forest at night, which is actually full of small sounds, but a dense, absolute quiet. The quiet of a room that has been emptied. The quiet of a place where everything that lived there has already left because something worse has moved in. Lewis Cox told Angelo afterward that it was the silence that undid him. "I've hunted my whole life, Father. Woods at night are supposed to be alive. These woods were holding their breath, like the whole forest was waiting for us to leave so something else could start." The patrols continued for a week. Found nothing. The men grew frustrated, then tired, then quietly unnerved in the way that people become unnerved not by what they see, but by the persistent, aggressive absence of explanation. They stopped patrolling. The attacks didn't. The first human attack happened on a Tuesday in late November. Bobby Klein lived with his wife, Jean Lawrence, and their 2 children in a farmhouse half a mile from the eastern edge of town. Bobby was 38, solidly built, a mechanic who kept half the vehicles in Calvary Hollow running through a combination of skill, stubbornness, and a parts inventory salvaged from 3 decades of junked cars stacked behind his shop. He was not a man who startled easily. He'd served in the military. He understood violence as a language, and he spoke it fluently enough to have made it home in one piece. He didn't hear them come. Jean told Angelo afterward, sitting in the church nave at 3 a.m, wrapped in a blanket, her children asleep on the pews behind her, that Bobby had gone onto the porch to investigate a sound. Not a dramatic sound, not a howl or a crash, just a scraping, metal on wood, like something was testing the screen door. He'd taken the flashlight, not the gun. He hadn't thought he'd need it. He'd opened the front door, stepped onto the porch. I swept the beam across the yard. The beam caught eyes, not 1 pair, not 2, 6, arranged in a semicircle at the edge of the porch light's reach, seated on their haunches the way dogs sit when they're being obedient, except that dogs don't grow that large and dogs' eyes don't carry the specific focused intelligence that Jean described seeing in the instant before they moved. They were on Bobby before the flashlight hit the ground. Jean heard the sounds from the kitchen. She grabbed the children, locked them in the bathroom, called 911, the county dispatcher, 22 miles away, promising a deputy in 30 to 45 minutes, and then did something that she would describe to Angelo with the flat, dissociated calm of someone recounting a dream. She went to the bedroom, loaded Bobby's hunting rifle, walked back to the front door, and fired 3 rounds into the yard. The sounds stopped. The eyes vanished. Bobby was on the porch, bleeding from his shoulder and his side and his left leg, conscious but silent. Not in shock, something else. His eyes were open, and they were tracking, but the expression behind them had changed. Jean said it was like looking at her husband through a window that had been installed between them overnight. He was there, but the distance between his face and whatever was happening behind it had grown. The deputy arrived 40 minutes later. Ambulance 20 minutes after that. Bobby was taken to the county hospital, treated for deep lacerations, animal attack, species unknown on the medical chart, and released 3 days later. He came home different, not injured different, changed different. He stopped speaking in full sentences, started standing at windows after dark, staring at the tree line with an expression that wasn't watching for something. It was watching with something. His eyes, Jean told Angelo in the church at 3 a.m. with her children sleeping behind her, had changed color. Not dramatically, subtly. The brown she'd looked into for 15 years of marriage had shifted, warmer, more amber, with a reflective quality that caught the light at angles. Brown eyes shouldn't. He looks at me, and I can tell he loves me, Jean said. But it's like the love is being translated through something that doesn't have the right words for it. Angelo held her hands, prayed with her, promised to visit Bobby the next day. And when Jean and the children had gone, and the church was empty, and the only light was the sanctuary lamp that burned beside the tabernacle, the small, perpetual flame that signified God's presence in the consecrated space, Angelo sat in the front pew and stared at that flame and felt, for the first time in his ministry, the cold edge of something he refused to call doubt. Not doubt in God, never that. Doubt in his own capacity to handle what was coming. Because something was coming, the circle of pins was tightening, the attacks were escalating, his town was contracting inward like a body going into shock, and he was one man with a Bible and a collar, and a faith that had never been tested by anything larger than human grief. Whatever was in those woods was not human grief. He went to the basement on a Wednesday, not looking for anything specific, looking for anything at all. He'd exhausted the obvious resources, scripture, prayer, conversations with his bishop that had been met with sympathetic concern and zero practical help. The diocese operated in a world of budgets and bureaucracy and rational explanation. A parish priest reporting supernatural predators in the woods was handled the same way the county deputy handled Derek Sullivan's pulled-apart fence, with paperwork and distance. The church basement was a graveyard of institutional memory, boxes of Christmas decorations, stacks of water-damaged hymnals from 3 different eras of liturgical fashion, a filing cabinet that contained 40 years of parish financial records organized by a succession of volunteer secretaries with incompatible systems, folding chairs, a broken projector. The accumulated sediment of 115 years of a small church trying to persist. He wasn't looking for the journal. He was looking for the parish records from the church's founding, some vague hope that the original charter or land deed might contain information about the property's history. What he found instead was a leather-bound book wedged behind the filing cabinet, pressed against the stone foundation wall, invisible unless you moved the cabinet entirely, which Angelo did only because he dropped a pen behind it and was too stubborn to let it go. The leather was cracked and dark with age. The pages inside were handwritten, dense, slanted script in ink that had faded from black to a deep sepia. The first page bore a name, Father Thomas Osborne, founded St. Matthias Church, Calvary Hollow, 1903. Angelo carried the journal upstairs, sat at his kitchen table, began to read, and the ground beneath everything he understood about his parish, his town, and his calling shifted in a way that would never shift back. Father Thomas Osborne had not built St. Matthias on empty land. He'd built it on claimed land, claimed not by a deed or a government, claimed by something that had lived in the hills since before the hills had names. Osborne's journal called them the Greycoats, not wolves, not men, something between, something older than either, occupying a space in the natural order that human taxonomy had no category for. Osborne had not driven them out. He'd made a deal. The journal laid it out in the careful, precise language of a man who understood that what he was writing would sound insane to anyone who hadn't seen what he'd seen. The Greycoats would withdraw, cede the valley, allow the town to be built, the mill to operate, the church to stand. In exchange, the pact required a payment every 100 years. A shepherd, a man of faith, given willingly, not taken by force, transformed by the Pact's alpha into something that could walk both worlds, human enough to maintain the bridge between species, wolf enough to enforce the boundary that kept the Greycoats from reclaiming what they considered theirs. The shepherd was the keystone. Without a human consciousness inside the pack, a moral center, a tether to empathy and reason, the Greycoats reverted to instinct, to predation, to the pure, efficient violence of apex predators operating without the moderating influence of a mind that understood mercy. The last shepherd had been given in 1918, so Father Osborne himself, Angelo read the final entries with a sensation like vertigo, had nominated a young deacon named Vernon Root, who had agreed, who had been transformed, who had walked into the woods on the night of the winter solstice and never returned. The church had been closed for 3 years after that, reopened in 1921 under a new priest who, the journal strongly implied, had been told nothing. The 100-year clock had started ticking in 1918. It was now 2018. Angelo set the journal down, looked at the map on his wall with its circle of red pins closing around the church, looked at the sanctuary lamp burning in the next room, steady and small and unwavering. He understood now. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to know that the animals in the woods weren't animals, that the attacks weren't random. That Bobby Klein's changing eyes and Chester Grimes's cowering dog and Hazel Melton's gold-eyed watcher in the tree line were all pieces of a single coherent picture that had been assembling itself for months. The Greycoats had come to collect. The pact was due. And Father Angelo Gillespie, sitting alone in his kitchen with a 100-year-old journal and a faith that suddenly felt less like a shield and more like a down payment on something enormous and irreversible, realized that the prayer he'd been saying every night, "Give me the strength to be the shepherd they need," had perhaps been answered all along, just not in the way he'd meant it. Chapter 3. The Visitation. He came on a Thursday. Angelo had stayed late in the church after the AA meeting, later than usual because the meeting had run long. The group was smaller now, not because people were drinking less, but because people were afraid to drive the back roads after dark. Attendance at everything had contracted. Fewer at the Thursday meetings, fewer at the Wednesday food bank, fewer at the Saturday Bible study. The town was pulling its limbs inward, retreating to the safety of locked doors and drawn curtains, and the church, which had always been the place people came when they didn't know where else to go, was becoming both a refuge and a reminder of how small the refuge was. Angelo locked the front doors at 9:30, checked the windows, turned off the overhead lights, leaving only the sanctuary lamp, that small, perpetual flame beside the tabernacle, the one constant in a building full of variables. He sat in the front pew to say his evening prayers, as he did every night, and he was halfway through the Our Father when he realized he was not alone. He didn't hear anything. That was the part he would later struggle to explain. On the tape, his voice thinning with the memory of it. There was no door opening, no footstep, no rustle of clothing or creak of wood. The presence simply appeared in the back of the church the way a thought appears in the mind, not arriving, but suddenly there, as if it had always been there and you'd only just noticed. Angelo turned. A man was sitting in the last pew, or something shaped like a man. The sanctuary lamp threw just enough light to catch the outline. Tall, lean, seated with a stillness that human bodies don't achieve. People fidget, they shift. They breathe in visible rhythms. This figure was as motionless as the stone walls around it, and the air in its vicinity had changed. Angelo could feel it from 40 feet away, a compression, a density, as if the atmosphere around this figure had been packed tighter than the atmosphere everywhere else, the way the air feels before lightning finds its ground. "Father Gillespie," the figure said. The voice was calm, unhurried. It carried the particular timbre of someone who has never needed to raise their voice because everything in their vicinity has already decided to listen. There was no threat in it, no menace, just the steady, absolute authority of something that had been in charge for so long that authority had become indistinguishable from identity. And Angelo stood. His heart was beating hard. He could feel it in his throat, his wrists, the palms of his hands. But his voice, when it came, was steady. 11 years of standing at the altar and speaking to a God he couldn't see had given him practice at addressing presences he couldn't fully comprehend. "The church is closed for the evening. I'm not here for the service." The figure leaned forward. The lamplight caught features, a face that was ageless in the way that certain faces are ageless, not young, not old, defined by planes and angles rather than the soft accumulations of time, eyes that reflected the sanctuary lamp's flame with a gold so deep it looked liquid, dark hair, skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He was dressed simply, dark clothing, no adornment, and he sat in the pew with a posture that suggested he was not unfamiliar with churches. "I know why you're here," Angelo said. "Then you've read the journal." "I've read it." "And you understand the terms." Angelo moved down the center aisle, not toward the figure, toward the midpoint, the place where the priest typically stood to deliver the homily during less formal services, the place where he felt most like himself. He stopped there, faced the figure in the back pew with the altar behind him and the crucifix above it, and he understood, with a clarity that felt almost architectural, that this was the position he'd been placed in, between God and the wolf, exactly where a shepherd stands. "I understand what Father Osborne wrote," Angelo said. "I understand that he made a deal. And I understand that a young man named Vernon Root walked into those woods 100 years ago and didn't come back." He paused. "What I don't understand is why you think I'd participate in continuing it." The figure, the alpha, Angelo had already accepted the term in his mind, because the journal had used it and because there was no other word for what this thing was, tilted his head. A small motion. Canine. The first gesture that broke the human illusion and reminded Angelo that what he was looking at was not a man sitting in a pew, but something else entirely, wearing a man's shape the way Angelo wore his vestments, as a uniform appropriate for the setting. "You would participate," the Alpha said, "because you've already calculated the alternative." "I've calculated nothing. I've prayed." "And what did your God tell you?" The question was not mocking. That was what unsettled Angelo most. There was genuine curiosity in it, the curiosity of something ancient encountering a belief system it had observed for centuries without fully understanding. The Alpha asked about God the way a scholar asks about a foreign custom, with respect for its importance, if not for its content. "God hasn't told me anything," Angelo said. "Yet. He won't." The Alpha stood. The motion was fluid, no effort, no transition between sitting and standing, just a change in state, the way water changes from still to flowing. He was taller than Angelo had expected, taller than any man in Calvary Hollow, taller, perhaps, than any man Angelo had ever met, though it was difficult to tell whether the height was physical or simply the result of a presence that seemed to occupy more space than the body accounting for it. "I don't say that to shake your faith, Father. I say it because I've watched 100 shepherds pray for a different answer. They never receive one. Your God, in my experience, does not intervene in agreements made between His children and the things that live in His wilder creation. He allows the terms to stand. He allows the choice to be made. And He allows the shepherd to walk into the woods. You speak as if you know God. I know silence. Your God and silence have much in common. The Alpha moved down the aisle, slowly. Each step deliberate, measured, the stride of something accustomed to covering vast distances with minimum waste. He stopped 10 feet from Angelo, close enough for the priest to see the details, the texture of the skin which was not quite right, too smooth, as if it had been resurfaced more times than human skin is designed to accommodate. The eyes, which were not reflecting the lamplight after all. They were generating their own, a low, steady golden luminescence that had nothing to do with the flame beside the tabernacle. The pact is simple, the Alpha said. One shepherd, willingly given, transformed by my hand into something that walks between your world and mine. The shepherd maintains the bridge, the human consciousness within the pack that prevents us from becoming what we were before the first shepherd was given. Without that bridge, we are instinct, we are hunger. We are the thing that lives in the dark because the dark is the only territory that will have us. He paused, and for the first time, something moved behind the gold eyes that Angelo recognized. Not cruelty, not calculation, weariness. I did not choose to be this, Father, no more than you chose to love these people. We are both products of a design we didn't author, serving functions we didn't request. The difference between us is that you have a God to attribute your purpose to. I have only the pact. Angelo felt something shift in his chest. Not sympathy. He couldn't afford sympathy for the thing threatening his flock. But recognition. The recognition of one servant speaking to another across an unbridgeable divide, each bound to a duty they hadn't asked for and couldn't put down. He pushed it aside. I will not give you a man, Angelo said. I will not participate in a pact that was made without the consent of the people it affects. I will not offer a human being to be consumed by whatever process you're describing. I will pray. I will trust in God's protection. And I will stand between you and my congregation for as long as I am standing. The Alpha regarded him. The golden eyes were steady, unblinking, and the expression behind them was one Angelo would think about for weeks afterward, long after the refusal, long after the consequences, long after the sound of 3 houses being torn open in the night forced him to reconsider every word he'd just spoken. The expression was not anger, it was not surprise. It was patience, the infinite, a geological patience of something that measured time in centuries and had learned that humans, given enough pressure, always arrived at the same destination. The route varied, the timeline varied, but the destination was fixed. I understand, the Alpha said, and he meant it. There was no irony, no subtext. He understood the refusal the way he understood weather, as a temporary condition that would change when the variables shifted. I will give you time, Father, not because the pact allows for negotiation, it doesn't, but because I have watched 100 shepherds and every one of them needed to arrive at the decision through their own suffering. The pact requires willingness, true willingness, not coercion, not desperation. The shepherd must choose with clear eyes and a full heart, or the transformation fails. He turned, walked toward the back of the church. At the door, he paused. The boundary will continue to dissolve. The attacks will continue. They will escalate. Not because I command them, because without a shepherd the pack operates on instinct, and instinct recognizes no boundaries. I can slow them. I cannot stop them. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes to hold them back. He looked over his shoulder. The gold eyes found Angelo's in the dim church, and the sanctuary lamp flickered, once, sharply, as if the flame itself had flinched. Pray, Father, pray as hard as you need to, but understand this. The answer you're looking for is not going to come from above. It's going to come from inside you, from the place where your love for these people is stored, because that love, not your faith, not your theology, not your God, that love is what makes you the right shepherd. It's what has always made the right shepherd. He left. The door didn't open. He simply wasn't there anymore. The back of the church empty, the pew vacant, the air decompressing slowly back to its normal weight. Angelo stood in the aisle for a long time. The sanctuary lamp burned beside him, small and steady. The crucifix hung above the altar, Christ's wooden face tilted downward in the permanent posture of a God who sees everything and explains nothing. He went to his knees, not because it was time for prayer, because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "Lord," he whispered into the empty church. "Lord, I need you to tell me there's another way. I need you to open a door I haven't seen. I need you to be the God who parts the sea and sends the angel and makes the impossible possible, because what this creature is asking me to do is—" He stopped. His voice broke, not with doubt, with the weight of understanding, because even as he prayed for another way, even as he begged for the miracle, even as he knelt in the house of God and asked the Almighty to intervene, he could feel in the deep architecture of his own heart the answer already forming, not from above. From inside. From the place where 11 years of loving 30 people had built a structure so solid that nothing, not theology, not self-preservation, not the instinct that tells every living thing to run when a predator approaches, could dismantle it. He would die for them. He'd always known that. It was the baseline of his vocation, the willingness to give his life for his flock, the foundational promise that every priest makes and hopes never to have tested. But what the Alpha was asking wasn't death. It was something worse, something that existed in a category his faith hadn't prepared for, a territory that the seminary hadn't mapped, a question that no theologian had ever needed to answer because no theologian had ever been asked it. Would you stop being human to save them? Would you become the thing in the dark, the very thing you've spent your life teaching them to reject, if it was the only way to keep the dark from swallowing them whole? He knelt in the empty church and he didn't answer. Not yet. But the question had been planted, and it was growing, and he could feel its roots spreading through the soil of everything he believed. That night, 3 houses on the eastern edge of town were attacked. No one was seriously injured. The damage was structural, doors torn from hinges, walls gouged, windows shattered inward. The families inside were untouched but surrounded, held in their bedrooms by the sound of massive bodies circling their homes, by the scrape of claws on siding, by gold eyes peering through broken glass with an intelligence that made every person who looked into them understand, with absolute and bone-deep certainty, that mercy was not the natural state of whatever was looking back. Angelo spent the night going house to house, comforting, praying, holding the hands of people who had come to church their whole lives, trusting that God and their priest would keep them safe. He held their hands and he looked into their faces, and he felt the question growing, and he said nothing, because the answer, when it came, would cost him everything, and he needed a little more time to be human before it arrived. Chapter 4. The Erosion of Certainty. December ate Calvary Hollow alive. Not all at once. Day by day, incident by incident, the way a river eats a bank, each current removing a thin layer of earth until the ground that seemed solid yesterday collapses without warning into the water. The town didn't fall apart. It eroded. And Angelo stood at the center of the erosion, trying to hold the bank together with his bare hands while the river kept coming. The attacks continued. Never lethal. That was the part that made it worse. A predator that kills is comprehensible. Nature is full of killing, and humans have built entire frameworks of understanding around it. Food chains, survival of the fittest, the circle of life. What the graycoats were doing wasn't killing, it was demonstrating. Each attack was a lesson in capability delivered with the precision of a professor who has all semester and intends to use it. Isaac Atkins, who farmed the southern slope, woke to find his barn doors ripped open and his horses standing in a perfect line in the yard. Unhurt, untouched, arranged shoulder to shoulder with a geometric precision that horses do not voluntarily achieve. They stood there, motionless, staring at the tree line, until Isaac walked among them and broke whatever spell or command was holding them in place. The horses scattered. 3 of them refused to enter the barn again. Isaac sold them within the week, at a loss, to a buyer in the next county who didn't ask questions. Renee Daniel found claw marks on her children's bedroom window. Not scratches, carved, deep grooves in the wooden frame, to cut with a deliberateness that suggested fingers rather than paws. The grooves spelled nothing. They meant nothing. They were simply proof that something had stood at her children's window in the dark, close enough to touch the glass, and had chosen to leave a mark instead of entering. The restraint was the message. The restraint said, "We are choosing not to. For now." Renee pulled her children out of school. 3 other families did the same. The elementary school in the next town, which served the surrounding rural area, noted the absences and sent letters home. The letters went unanswered. How do you explain to a school administrator that your children aren't attending because something is carving its initials into their bedroom windows at night? The Thursday meetings became something between a town council and a group therapy session. And Angelo moderated, which meant he stood in the church basement and absorbed the fear and the anger and the desperation of people who had been pushed to the edge of what their understanding of the world could accommodate. "We should call the state police," Bill Patterson said. He said it every week. The suggestion had the quality of a prayer, repeated not because anyone believed it would work, but because the act of saying it provided the temporary comfort of feeling like a reasonable person in an unreasonable situation. "And tell them what?" Gladys Ryan replied, with her characteristic absence of padding. "That our livestock is being rearranged by artistic wolves? That something is vandalizing our homes with surgical precision? They'll send a wildlife officer, Bill. A man with a tranquilizer gun and a pamphlet about bear-proofing your trash cans." "Then we fight," said Lewis Cox. He'd been saying this with increasing conviction for weeks. Lewis was ex-military, built like a man who'd spent his 20s carrying heavy things over long distances, and his proposed solution to every problem involved direct action and sufficient firepower. "We organize, we arm up. We go into those woods and we find whatever's in there and we end it." "You went into those woods," Angelo said quietly. 4 trucks, 8 men, rifles. You found nothing. "Then we go deeper. We stay longer. Lewis." Angelo's voice carried the gentle, immovable authority he used when a conversation was heading somewhere it couldn't productively go. "I've been in these woods my entire time here. I've hiked every trail and walked every ridge. Whatever is doing this doesn't live in the woods the way animals live in the woods. It doesn't leave tracks. It doesn't follow patterns. It's not something you can hunt because it's not hiding. It's waiting." The room was quiet, the specific, weighted quiet of people who have arrived at the edge of what they're willing to accept and are looking at the drop. "Then what do we do, Father?" Eleanor Thomas asked. She was sitting in her usual chair, front row, far right, the same seat she occupied every Sunday and every Thursday, and every time the church opened its doors. 83 years old, $1.37 in the collection plate. A woman who had survived 2 world wars, a depression, the death of a husband and a son, and the slow decline of the only town she'd ever known. Her voice, when she asked the question, was not frightened. It was the voice of a woman who had been asking men in charge for answers her entire life and had learned to calibrate her expectations accordingly. "I'm working on it," Angelo said. It was the most dishonest thing he'd ever said from behind the authority of his collar. He wasn't working on anything. He was drowning. He was reading Father Osborne's journal every night and finding more detail, more history, more evidence that the pact was real, and the consequences of ignoring it were exactly what the Alpha had described. He was praying with a ferocity that left him exhausted, his knees bruised from the stone floor of the church, his voice hoarse from the hours of whispered supplication that he poured into the silence above the altar. God listened. Angelo was certain of that. God was present in the church the way God had always been present, vast, steady, incomprehensible, filling the space between the stones with something that Angelo had spent his entire ministry learning to feel. But God did not answer. Not a whisper. Not a sign. Not a conveniently timed scripture reading that illuminated the path. The divine silence was absolute, and its absoluteness was slowly, methodically dismantling Angelo's certainty, not his faith, never his faith, but his confidence that faith alone was sufficient to solve a problem that existed outside the categories his faith had been designed to address. He began to wonder, in the dark, in the small hours, in the space between the last prayer and the first light of dawn, whether God's silence was the answer. Whether the absence of intervention was itself the message, not "I will not help you," but "I have already helped you. I gave you this heart. I gave you this love. I gave you these people. What you do with those gifts is the prayer I've been waiting for." It was a terrifying thought, because it meant the decision was his. It had always been his, and God was not going to take it from him. Bobby Klein disappeared on a Wednesday. Jean had been monitoring him. Or trying to. Since the attack, Bobby had become progressively less present. Not absent, he went to work, came home, ate meals, played with the children in a way that approximated his pre-attack behavior closely enough to fool anyone who wasn't watching carefully. But Jean was watching carefully. She was watching the way his eyes tracked movement that wasn't there. The way he stood at the windows after dark, not looking out but listening, his head tilted at an angle that humans don't use but animals do, the angle that catches sound from maximum directions. The way his body had changed, not visibly, not in a way she could point to and say there, that's different, but in the way it occupied space. He moved more quietly, took up less room, flowed around furniture and through doorways with a fluidity that his mechanic's body had never possessed. She told Angelo about it during her visits to the church, which had become weekly, then bi-weekly, then nearly daily. She sat in the same pew each time, third row, left side, and spoke in the controlled, precise voice of a woman who was managing her own disintegration with the organizational skills she typically reserved for household logistics. "He's leaving at night," she told Angelo on the Tuesday before Bobby disappeared. "I pretend to be asleep and I watch him. He gets out of bed around 2 a.m, doesn't dress, just walks out the back door barefoot in his underwear in December. He walks to the tree line and he stands there, sometimes for an hour, just standing, looking into the woods, and sometimes I hear something answer him. Not words, not a howl, something lower, something that goes through the ground more than the air, and he, 'Father,' he responds, the same sound, from his chest, like a vibration." She paused, pressed her hands flat on the pew in front of her, steadying herself against a reality that was doing its best to knock her sideways. "He's not my husband anymore. He's something wearing my husband's shape. And whatever is in those woods is calling him home." Angelo held her hands, prayed with her, promised, again, uselessly with the hollow conviction of a man making promises he couldn't keep, that he would find a way to help. Bobby left the next night. Jean woke at 2 and he was gone. The back door was open, his boots were by the bed, his wallet was on the nightstand, his wedding ring was on the kitchen counter, placed with a precision that suggested not carelessness but intention, a deliberate setting down of something that belonged to a life he was leaving. They found him 3 days later. Hikers from the county, outsiders who didn't know the unspoken rule about staying out of the deep woods, reported seeing a man walking naked among the trees, roughly 2 miles north of town. When the sheriff's deputy arrived, Bobby was sitting on a fallen log, calm, clear-eyed, and entirely unable to explain how he'd gotten there. He had no injuries, no signs of exposure, despite 3 December nights in the woods without clothing. His eyes, Jean confirmed when he was brought home, were no longer the almost amber they'd shifted to after the attack. They were gold. Pure, deep, liquid gold. The same gold that Hazel Melton had seen watching her from the tree line. The same gold that had peered through Renee Daniels' children's window. Bobby came home, resumed his life, went back to work, but something had been completed in those 3 days in the woods, some process that the attack had started and the forest had finished. He was Bobby, and he was not Bobby. And the town absorbed this contradiction the way small towns absorb all contradictions, by not talking about it. Angelo talked about it, To himself in the rectory, pacing his small kitchen at midnight with Father Osborne's journal open on the table. Without a shepherd, the pack operates on instinct. The shepherd is the human consciousness that keeps them tethered to something beyond pure predation. Bobby Klein was not the shepherd. Bobby had been taken, not given. The pact required willingness, but Bobby was proof of what the pact could do without a shepherd's moderating influence. They could take, they could transform, they could reach into a man's house, into his body, into the architecture of his identity, and rebuild him from the inside. The Alpha had said the boundary was dissolving. Bobby Klein was the proof. And if one man could be taken involuntarily, changed against his will, pulled into the woods by a call he couldn't resist, what would happen when the boundary dissolved completely? When the pack's instinct was no longer tempered by the fading influence of a shepherd given 100 years ago? Angelo knew the answer. He'd read it in Osborne's journal. The entries from before the first shepherd was given. The entries describing what the Greycoats had been before a human consciousness had been introduced to the pack were the most disturbing pages Angelo had ever read. Not because of the violence described, because of the absence of anything but violence. Pure predation, an intelligence without empathy, operating with the efficiency and amorality of a natural disaster. He closed the journal, looked at the map with its circle of red pins, and looked at the crucifix on his kitchen wall, a small wooden one, the same one he'd hung in every rectory he'd ever occupied, the face of Christ looking down with the eternal expression of a God who understood suffering because he'd chosen it. Chosen it. Angelo pressed his palms to his eyes. The thought was there now, the one he'd been trying not to think, the one that had been growing since the Alpha sat in the back pew and spoke about love as if it were a navigational tool. Christ had chosen suffering, had walked toward it with clear eyes and a full heart, had allowed himself to be transformed from living man to crucified body to resurrected something else, for the sake of the people he loved. The theology was different, the mechanism was different, the scale was incomprehensible by comparison, but the structure was the same. A shepherd, a flock, a predator that would consume them all, and a choice, made willingly, made in love, made with the full understanding that what came after would bear no resemblance to what came before, to stand between the flock and the dark, and let the dark take him instead. Angelo dropped his hands, looked at the crucifix. "Is that what you're telling me?" he whispered. "Is that the answer? That the precedent isn't in the pact? It's in the cross?" The wooden Christ said nothing. The kitchen was silent. The town was silent. The woods beyond the town held their breath with the patient, predatory stillness of something that had already won and was simply waiting for the last player to realize it. Angelo stood in his kitchen at midnight and felt the last structural support of his resistance begin to give way. Not with a snap. With a slow, quiet yielding, the sound of a man's certainty that there must be another way finally bowing under the accumulated weight of evidence that there wasn't. He didn't decide that night, but the decision moved closer. He could feel it approaching the way the town felt the Greycoats approaching, not as a single event, but as a tide. Inevitable, patient, rising, and like a tide, it would arrive whether he was ready for it or not. Chapter 5. The Decision. The wolves came to church on the second Sunday of January. Angelo was mid-homily. He'd chosen his text carefully that morning, Matthew 14, the story of Peter walking on water. He'd been talking about faith as an active choice, about the moment Peter stepped out of the boat onto the impossible surface of the storm-churned sea, about how faith isn't the absence of doubt, but the decision to step forward despite it. He was speaking from the heart, not reading notes, not following a script, just talking to the 30 people in the pews the way he'd talked to them for 11 years, directly, honestly, with the intimate urgency of a man who believed every word he said and needed them to believe it too. He was 3 sentences from the end of the homily when the doors opened, not burst, opened. The heavy oak doors of St. Matthias swung inward with the slow, deliberate motion of something that understood the dramatic vocabulary of entrances, Cold January air poured into the nave, carrying the mineral smell of frozen earth and something else, something wild, something that the human nose identifies before the conscious mind does, something that every mammal recognizes as the scent of an apex predator. The congregation turned. Angelo saw their faces, the way they changed, the way the color drained from them in a wave that moved from the back pews to the front, like a tide receding, leaving pale, exposed stone where water had been. The wolves entered the church, not running, not snarling, walking, single file down the center aisle with a poise that was more disturbing than any display of aggression could have been. There were 7 of them, each one enormous, the size of a large man on all fours, which meant standing they would have dwarfed anyone in the room. Their fur was dark, not black, not gray, but a deep shifting color that seemed to absorb the light from the stained glass windows and give nothing back. Their eyes were gold, all 14 of them, steady, luminous, carrying an intelligence that made the air in the church feel like it was being observed from the inside. They walked down the aisle, past the frozen congregation, past Eleanor Thomas, who gripped the back of the pew in front of her with both hands and did not look away, past Gladys Ryan, who had stopped breathing, past Phil Hart, who had instinctively reached for the hip where he used to carry a sidearm 20 years ago and found nothing, past Lucia Bennett, who pressed her hand over her mouth and made a sound that wasn't a scream. It was too quiet for a scream, too controlled, the sound of a woman who understood that screaming would change nothing. The wolves reached the front pews. They separated, 3 to the left, 4 to the right. They sat, on their haunches, in the pews, the way congregants sit. They faced the altar, they faced Angelo, and they waited. The church was silent. Not the productive silence of reflection or the comfortable silence of shared peace. The absolute crystalline silence of 30 human beings sitting in the presence of something that their understanding of the world had no space for, and the architecture of their reality straining under the weight. Angelo stood at the altar. The crucifix hung above him. The sanctuary lamp burned beside the tabernacle. His hands were gripping the edges of the lectern so hard that his knuckles had gone white, and the wood was creaking under the pressure. He looked at the wolves. The wolves looked at him, and Angelo Gillespie, parish priest of St. Matthias, did the only thing his training and his faith and his 11 years of standing in this exact spot had prepared him to do. He finished the homily. His voice shook. He won't deny that. On the tape, he admits it freely. His voice shook, and his hands shook, and every cell in his body was screaming at him to run. But he opened his mouth, and he spoke the last 3 sentences of his sermon about Peter and the water and the faith that carries you past the impossible. And when he was done, he made the sign of the cross and said, "Let us continue with the liturgy of the Eucharist." The wolves stayed for the entire Mass, through the consecration, through the communion, during which no parishioner moved from their seat, the wafers untouched, the wine undrunk, through the final blessing, through the dismissal. Then they stood, turned, walked back up the center aisle with the same measured, deliberate pace, and left. The doors swung closed behind them. Nobody moved for 4 full minutes. Angelo counted. 4 minutes of paralysis, of silence, of 30 human beings sitting in the house of God and trying to reconstruct a version of reality that could accommodate what they'd just experienced. Eleanor Thomas was the first to speak. From her seat in the front row, right side, and in the voice of a woman who had survived everything the 20th century had thrown at her and was not about to let the 21st century finish the job. "Well," she said, "I think we can agree that wasn't coyotes." The congregation didn't shatter. Angelo had expected it to, had braced for a mass exodus, a stampede of families packing cars and fleeing to the county seat or beyond. But that's not what happened. What happened was something more complex and more painful. The congregation divided. Some left. The Daniel family was first. Renee loaded the children into the car that afternoon and drove to her sister's house in another state. 3 more families followed within the week. No judgment attached, no blame. They had children. They had a right to protect them. and the protection that Calvary Hollow could offer had been revealed in the most dramatic way possible to be insufficient. Some stayed and wanted war. Lewis Cox organized a meeting at the diner, not the church, deliberately, and proposed an armed response. Go into the woods, find the den, end this. A dozen men attended. They talked until midnight, planning an operation that would have been appropriate for coyotes or bears or any threat that operated within the parameters of the natural world. Angelo was not invited. He heard about it from Lucia Bennett, who had served the men coffee and listened to their plans with the expression of someone watching children stack blocks without understanding that the foundation was wrong. And some, the smallest group, the quietest, came to Angelo individually, in the confessional, in the rectory kitchen, in the parking lot after a service that had become sparsely attended and heavy with the weight of unspoken fear. "Father," Phil Hart said, standing by his truck in the January cold, his breath visible, his eyes carrying the particular burden of a man who has arrived at a thought he doesn't want to have. "Is there something you're not telling us?" Angelo looked at him. Phil Hart, hardware store, hadn't taken communion in 6 years, a practical man who believed in God the way he believed in weather, as a force that existed whether you acknowledged it or not, and occasionally required you to board up your windows. "Why do you ask?" "Because I've known you 11 years, and you're the most honest man I've ever met, and for the past month, you've been lying. Not about the details and about the size of it. You know something about what's in those woods. You've known for a while, and whatever it is, it's eating you alive." Phil pulled his coat tighter. "I'm not asking you to fix this, Father. I'm asking you to tell me the truth. Because if you can't fix it and you can't tell me the truth, then we've got nothing left." Angelo stood in the parking lot and felt the weight of the journal in his mind. The pact, the shepherd, the 100-year clock that had run out. He could tell Phil. He could tell all of them. He could spread the journal's contents across the Thursday meeting and let the congregation decide together, democratically, the way American communities are supposed to decide things. But the pact required willingness. One man, given freely. If Angelo told them, they would argue, they would debate, and eventually, inevitably, they would arrive at the same calculation Angelo had been circling for weeks, that one life was a reasonable price for the survival of the town, and they would start looking around the room for the person most expendable. He knew who they would choose, not out of cruelty, out of the same arithmetic his own heart had been running since December, the person with the fewest attachments, the person whose absence would leave the smallest hole, the person who was already, by the nature of his vocation, dedicated to the service of others at the expense of himself. They would choose him, and it would no longer be his choice. It would be theirs. The sacrifice would be contaminated by committee, by the guilt of people who had nominated their priest for something they couldn't fully understand, by the subtle, corrosive knowledge that they had sent a man into the dark because they were afraid to go themselves. He wouldn't do that to them. He wouldn't let them carry that. "I'm working on it, Phil," he said. The same lie, delivered with the same steady gaze. "Trust me a little longer." Phil looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, got in his truck, drove away. Angelo stood in the empty parking lot. The January wind cut through his coat. The woods beyond the church property were dark and still and watching. He went inside, locked the doors, walked to the front pew, the one where he'd sat 20 years ago when he first felt the call to ministry, when the idea of devoting his life to the service of others had descended on him like a hand on his shoulder, gentle and irresistible and permanent. He sat in that pew. He did not pray. For the first time in his adult life, Angelo Gillespie did not pray, not because he'd lost his faith, because he'd moved past the need for an answer he already had. Prayer, for him, had always been a conversation, a reaching upward for guidance, for comfort, for the reassurance that someone larger than himself was watching and caring and steering. But the steering was done. The destination was visible. The only thing left was the walking. He sat in the silence of his church, and he thought about the 30 people who depended on him. Eleanor Thomas with her $1.37. Lucia Bennett with her unlocked back door. Gladys Ryan with her bluntness that was really a form of love. Phil Hart with his 6 years of uncommuned guilt. Jean Lawrence, and holding her changed husband's hand and pretending the gold in his eyes was a trick of the light. The children, the old, the stubborn and the poor and the good, decent, ordinary people who had built their lives around a church that sat on borrowed land and a priest who was about to pay the debt. He loved them, not abstractly, specifically, each one, with a love that had been accumulating for 11 years, compounding like interest, growing so large it had become structural, not a feeling but a fact, not an emotion but an architecture. His love for these people was the building he lived in, it was the ground under his feet, it was the air in his lungs, and it was, he understood now, the thing that made him the right shepherd, not his faith, not his theology. Not his ordination or his collar or his ability to stand at an altar and say the words that turned bread into body. His love, specific, imperfect, accumulated over 11 years of showing up. The Alpha had told him that. He hadn't been ready to hear it then. He was ready now. He went to the woods at midnight. Alone. No flashlight. No Bible. Just his body, his collar, and the decision that had been building inside him since the Alpha sat in the back pew and spoke about love as if it were a compass. He didn't have to go far. The Alpha was waiting at the tree line, standing in human form, dressed in the same dark clothing, his golden eyes visible in the moonlight like two small fires burning in the shadow of the pines. "I have conditions," Angelo said. The Alpha inclined his head, listening. 3. First, my congregation is protected. Not just now, permanently. The pact resets. No future generation of Calvary Hollow is threatened. The boundary holds forever. Agreed. Second, I keep my mind, my consciousness, my human awareness. I will not become a feral thing. The shepherd role, as described in the journal, a human intelligence inside the pack. That is what I agree to. Nothing less. That is what the pact has always provided. The shepherd's awareness is the point. Without it, the role is meaningless. Third, Angelo paused. This one cost him more than the others. I'm allowed to say goodbye, not the truth. They can't know. But I need time to close this properly, to leave them something, to make sure the church survives my absence. The Alpha studied him. Alpha. The golden eyes moved across Angelo's face with the thoroughness of something that had been reading human expressions for centuries and had learned to see past the surface into the machinery beneath. How much time? 2 weeks? Something shifted in the Alpha's expression. Not surprise, recognition, the look of someone who has heard this request before, many times, and knows exactly what those 2 weeks will contain. You should know what those 2 weeks will hold, the Alpha said. The transformation does not wait for the final night. It begins the moment you agree. Your body will change, your senses, your thoughts. Piece by piece, night by night, you will lose what you are and gain what you will become. By the 14th night, the man you are now will be gone. The shepherd will remain. Angelo felt the words land in his body, not in his mind, where he could analyze and theologize and build frameworks of understanding around them, but in his chest, his gut, the animal core of him that understood exactly what was being described and was screaming at him to run. He didn't run. Will it hurt? The Alpha looked at him with eyes that had watched 100 men ask this question, 100 priests, 100 shepherds who had stood at this exact threshold and needed to hear the truth before they stepped across. Every second, the Alpha said. The wolf does not come gently. It comes by eating what was there before. Angelo closed his eyes, felt the January cold on his face, felt the collar around his neck, the small white band that signified everything he'd built his life upon. Felt the love in his chest, the structural, architectural, immovable love for 30 people who would never know what he was about to do for them. Then let it eat, he said. I'm not using it anymore. The Alpha extended his hand. It was, in the moonlight, almost human. Almost. Angelo took it. And in the woods behind St. Matthias Church, under a January sky full of cold stars, the clock began. 14 nights. Chapter 6. The 14 Nights, Part 1. From the tape.
The first thing that changes is the hearing. Nobody tells you that. You expect the teeth, the claws, the fur, the Hollywood version, the monster movie transformation. But it doesn't start with the body. It starts with the world getting louder. And it never stops.
Night 1. Angelo woke at 3 in the morning and heard Eleanor Thomas's heart beating. She lived 4 houses away. He knew this because he'd walked the route 1,000 times, from the rectory, left on Main, past the hardware store, past the empty lot where the barber shop used to be, to the small clapboard house with the iron mailbox and the rose bushes she'd maintained for 40 years. 4 houses, perhaps 300 yards. He lay in bed and listened to her heart. It was slow, steady. The rhythm of a woman in deep sleep, her 83-year-old body running the night shift with the reliable, unhurried pace of a machine that has been well maintained. He could hear the valves, the specific click rush of blood passing through chambers, the tiny hydraulic percussion that most people experience only through a stethoscope pressed directly to skin. He could hear it from 300 yards away, through walls and air and the insulation of 4 separate buildings. He lay there for an hour, cataloging. Not by choice. His ears were doing it automatically, pulling signal from noise with a sensitivity that turned the sleeping town into an orchestra. Heartbeats, breathing patterns, the creak of bed springs as Derek Sullivan turned over in his sleep half a mile south, the tick of the clock in Lucia Bennett's diner. A mouse in the church walls, he could hear its claws on the interior of the plaster, the tiny scratching travel of a creature so small it existed entirely within the infrastructure of the building. He heard the woods. That was the part that made him press his pillow over his ears and whisper prayers into the cotton. The woods were not silent anymore. They were teeming. A vast, layered soundscape of movement and breath, and the low, subsonic communication of things that lived in the spaces between the trees. He could hear the graycoats, not close, miles away, but their sounds carried deep, resonant vibrations that traveled through the ground as much as the air, the seismic language of a pack coordinating across territory. He understood some of it, not the meaning, not yet, but the structure, the way certain vibrations prompted responses, the way the pack communicated in call and answer patterns that were too organized to be animal and too alien to be language. It was something that his brain was beginning to tune into, the way a radio tunes to a frequency, the static clearing incrementally, the signal sharpening. He got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the mug, and listened to the world he'd lived in for 11 years reveal itself as something vastly larger and more detailed than he'd ever understood. The coffee tasted different, stronger. He could identify individual compounds, the bitterness of the roast, the mineral content of the water, a faint sweetness that he'd never noticed before, and that he suspected was the residual sugar from the ceramic glaze of the mug itself. His tongue was reporting information it had never been asked to gather. He said Mass that morning. Normal. Routine. 14 people in the pews. Attendance had dropped since the wolves' visit. He stood at the altar and performed the liturgy he'd performed thousands of times, and everything was the same except that he could hear every heartbeat in the room. He could hear Phil Hart's elevated pulse. Anxiety, he realized, the mechanical signature of a man carrying unresolved stress. He could hear Eleanor Thomas's steady metronome. He could hear the baby in Cindy Ryan's arms breathing with the shallow, rapid rhythm of infant sleep. He could smell them. Not body odor. Not perfume. Emotion. Cindy Ryan smelled like warm milk and the specific oxytocin-laced sweetness of a mother holding a child. Phil Hart smelled metallic, sharp, coppery, the olfactory signature of someone whose adrenal system was operating at a sustained elevation. Eleanor Thomas smelled like lavender and old paper and the woody undertone that Angelo would later identify as the scent of someone whose body was preparing, slowly and without urgency, to die. Not imminently, not soon, but the process had begun. and his enhanced senses could detect it the way a dog detects a seizure, through chemical signals too faint for human noses but clear as sirens to whatever he was becoming. He didn't tell anyone. What would he say? I can hear your heart from 300 yards. I can smell your grief. The world has become a sensory symphony that is simultaneously the most beautiful and the most overwhelming thing I've ever experienced, and it's only night one. He went to confession instead, not at St. Matthias, at Sacred Heart, the parish church in the next town over, 18 miles east. Father Caesar Dwyer served there, a man Angelo had known for 15 years, a seminary classmate who had chosen a slightly less remote parish and who Angelo trusted with the particular trust that exists between men who have shared the strange, isolating experience of training for the priesthood. He didn't tell Caesar the truth. He couldn't. Instead, he confessed what he could, that he was struggling, that he was facing a decision that would change everything, that he was afraid, not of the decision itself, but of what it would make him. Caesar listened the way good priests listen, without interruption, without judgment, with the full, generous attention of a man who understands that confession is not about advice, but about witness. Angelo, Caesar said when it was over, whatever this is, and I can tell it's bigger than what you're saying, I want you to remember something. God doesn't call us to comfort. He calls us to faithfulness, and sometimes faithfulness looks like the most insane thing you've ever done. Angelo almost laughed. Almost. He drove home with the windows down, letting the January air flood the car, and he could smell every mile. The frozen earth, the diesel from a truck 3 roads over, the specific chemical signature of the pine sap that bled from the trees along the highway. The world was opening up, getting larger, getting louder, and the man inside it was getting smaller, making room for whatever was growing in his place. Nights 2 and 3. The senses continued to sharpen. By the second night, he could hear conversations inside closed houses from the street. By the third, he could track individual animals moving through the woods by sound alone, mapping their positions, their speed, their species, the way a radar operator tracks aircraft on a screen. He learned to manage it, not control, manage, the way someone with chronic pain learns to function around the pain rather than waiting for it to stop. He developed techniques, focusing on a single sound to filter out the noise, breathing exercises that narrowed his attention, the repetition of scripture in his mind, not for spiritual comfort, but as a cognitive anchor, a familiar structure to hold on to while the architecture of his perception was being rebuilt from the inside. He preached on Sunday. The homily was about the burning bush, Moses encountering God in a form that was simultaneously natural and impossible, a bush that burned but was not consumed. He spoke about the courage required to approach the impossible, to stand before something you couldn't explain and not run. The congregation, 22 people, smaller than last week, listened with an attention that Angelo could feel in the room. Not just hear, feel. The collective focus of 22 human beings directed at a single point, and that focus had a weight, a presence, a texture that his enhanced senses interpreted as something almost physical. He stood in it and let it wash over him, and understood, with a sadness that went all the way to the marrow, that he was feeling what it felt like to be loved by a room full of people, and that this was one of the last times he would feel it as a man. He preached better than he'd ever preached. The words came with a clarity and a passion that surprised him. Not the careful, measured delivery of a trained homilist, but the raw, the urgent outpouring of a man who knows his time is short and has things to say that cannot wait for proper phrasing. The congregation noticed. Lucia Bennett told him after the service that it was the best sermon she'd ever heard. Eleanor Thomas simply squeezed his hand and held it for a moment longer than usual, and the look in her eyes suggested that she sensed something, not the specifics, not the truth, but the shape of it, the contour of a goodbye. Nights 4 through 7. The body began to change. It started with strength. On the 4th morning, Angelo reached for the heavy oak lectern to adjust its position and moved it 6 inches with one hand. The lectern weighed approximately 80 pounds. He'd always needed both hands and a certain amount of determination to shift it. Now it slid across the altar platform as if it were mounted on wheels. He dropped a glass in the rectory kitchen that evening. His hand shot out and caught it before it passed his waist. Not a conscious reaction, not a decision to catch it, but a reflex so fast that his mind received notification of the catch after the catch was already complete. The glass sat in his hand unbroken, and he stared at it for a full minute, trying to reconcile what his body had just done with what his body was supposed to be capable of. The pain came on night 5. He woke in the dark to a grinding in his forearms. Deep, structural, the sound and sensation of bone under renovation. Not breaking, restructuring. The skeletal architecture of his hands was changing, millimeter by millimeter, the joints shifting, the fingers elongating, the knuckle geometry altering to accommodate a grip pattern that human hands were never designed for. He lay in bed and pressed his fists into the mattress and rode it out, breathing through his teeth, sweat soaking the pillow. By morning, his hands looked almost normal. Almost. The fingers were slightly longer, the nails were thicker, harder, with a curvature that hadn't been there before. He wrapped them in cloth, told the parishioners who noticed that he'd burned himself repairing the boiler. A mundane lie for an impossible truth. Night 6 brought the hunger. He'd been eating normally, or trying to, but the food had lost its appeal. The bread and soup and simple fare he'd sustained himself on for 11 years tasted flat, distant, as if his taste buds had recalibrated for a menu his kitchen didn't serve. He walked past the butcher counter at the general store and stopped. Stood there for 5 minutes, staring at the raw cuts of beef behind the glass, and the hunger that rose in him had nothing to do with his stomach. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere cellular, somewhere ancient, and it wanted what was behind the glass with an intensity that made his vision narrow and his mouth fill with saliva and his fingers, his changed, elongating fingers, curl against his palms. He left the store, went to the church, knelt at the altar, prayed for 3 hours with the desperate, clinging persistence of a man holding onto a rope while the current pulls him downstream. The prayer helped. Not by removing the hunger, nothing would remove it, but by reminding him who he still was. Angelo Gillespie, priest, shepherd. A man who knelt before God not because he expected rescue, but because the act of kneeling was itself a statement of identity. I am still human. I am still yours. The wolf is growing, but the man is still here. Night 7. He preached again. This time the homily was not planned. He stood at the altar and looked at the 19 people in the pews, fewer again, the count dropping like a slow heartbeat, and the prepared notes in his hand seemed irrelevant, small, inadequate for what he needed to say. He set them aside, gripped the lectern with hands he'd wrapped in cloth, and spoke. He talked about love, not the theological abstraction, the real thing, the inconvenient, expensive, unphotogenic love that exists in the space between people who have chosen to remain in proximity despite every reason to leave. The love that brings a man to a dying woman's bedside at 3 a.m. The love that unlocks a diner's back door for strangers on cold nights. The love that puts $1.37 in a collection plate every Sunday because that's what you have and you will not miss a week. He talked about sacrifice, about how the word has been sanitized by theology and dulled by repetition until it means nothing more than giving something up, about how real sacrifice isn't giving something up, it's giving something away. The difference between putting a coin in a jar and putting your hand in a fire. One costs you something, the other changes you into something else. He was talking about himself. He knew it. They didn't. And the gap between what he was saying and what they were hearing was the loneliest space he'd ever occupied. After the service, he began the letters. He sat at his kitchen table with a stack of paper and a pen, and he wrote to every person in his congregation. 30 letters, 1 for each pew, personal, specific, full of the things he'd meant to say over 11 years and had kept saving for later because there was always supposed to be more time. To Eleanor Thomas, he wrote about the $37. about how he'd watched her place it in the plate every week for 11 years, and how that small, faithful act had taught him more about devotion than any seminary course. To Phil Hart, he wrote about the 6 years of absent communion, about how God's patience wasn't a countdown, but an open door, and how the door had never closed and never would. To Lucia Bennett, he wrote about the back door, about how he'd known for years and had never said anything because some acts of grace are so pure that acknowledging them would diminish them. To Jean Lawrence, he wrote about Bobby, about how love that survives transformation is the strongest love there is, and how she should not stop holding his hand, even when the hand felt different. He wrote until dawn. His hands ached, the bones shifting, the joints protesting, the changing architecture of his fingers making the pen harder to grip with each passing hour. By the time the last letter was finished, his handwriting had deteriorated from its usual precise script to something rougher, more angular, the writing of a man whose fine motor control was being quietly repossessed. He folded each letter, wrote a name on each one, and in the gray light of a January morning, with his changed hands and his sharpened ears, and a body that was slowly, methodically being eaten and rebuilt by something that lived in the spaces between human and wild, Father Angelo Gillespie walked to his church and placed a letter in every pew, one for each, hidden in the hymnals, waiting to be found. He stood at the altar and looked at the empty pews and the hidden letters and felt, beneath the sadness and the loss and the bone-deep ache of transformation, something he hadn't expected. Gratitude, not for the pact, not for the sacrifice, for the 11 years, for the 30 people, for the privilege, and it was a privilege. He understood that now, with a clarity that the wolf's reshaping of his mind had somehow sharpened rather than diminished, of having been their shepherd. He touched the altar. The wood was warm under his cloth-wrapped fingers. 7 nights down, 7 to go. Chapter 7, The 14 Nights, Part 2. From the tape.
The body I could handle. Pain is pain. You breathe through it, you ride it. You remind yourself why you're doing this and you hold on. But when the mind started to change, when the thoughts started coming in a shape I didn't recognize, that's when I understood what the Alpha meant when he said the wolf comes by eating what was there before. It doesn't replace you. It digests you. And what comes out the other side is something that remembers being you the way you remember being a child. The facts are there. The feelings are translated.
Night 8. He caught himself thinking about the church as territory. Not the building, the land, the property, the boundaries of the lot, the tree line, the road, the invisible perimeter that separated St. Matthias from the surrounding woods. He'd always known these boundaries in the abstract way that a property owner knows where his land ends and his neighbor's begins. Now he knew them in his body. He could feel the edges, not metaphorically, not spiritually, but as a physical awareness, a pressure map that told him where the boundary was, how far it extended, what was inside it and what was outside. His parishioners were inside. He could feel them, not individually, not yet, but as a collective warmth. A cluster of heartbeats and breathing patterns and thermal signatures that his changing brain was beginning to categorize not as people, but as flock. The word wasn't his. It came from somewhere else. From the thing growing inside his skull alongside his human consciousness, the second mind that had been assembling itself quietly for a week and was now large enough to contribute vocabulary. He sat in the rectory and pressed his palms to his temples and tried to push the word back. Flock. They're not a flock. They're people. Eleanor, Phil, Lucia, Gladys. They have names. They have histories. They are individuals, not a collective, not a flock. The word settled into place like a bone finding its socket. And the worst part, the part that Angelo would later describe on the tape with a voice that shook not with distress, but with the exhaustion of honest confession, was that it wasn't wrong. It was accurate. It was a more efficient description of his relationship to these people than anything his human vocabulary had produced in 11 years. He loved them. He protected them. He stood between them and the dark. He guided them toward sustenance and safety and meaning. He was their shepherd. He had always been their shepherd. The wolf wasn't giving him a new role. It was naming the one he'd always had, in a language stripped of human pretension. That was night 8, the night the wolf started finishing his sentences, night 9. A stranger came to the Thursday meeting, not a gray coat, a man, mid-30s, wearing a jacket too thin for January, with the sunburned neck and calloused hands of someone who worked outdoors. He said his name was Sam Haynes, and he'd driven in from 2 counties over because he'd heard about the animal problems and wondered if the town needed help. He said he'd worked with wildlife management. He said he had experience with large predator situations. Everything about him was plausible. His story made sense. His demeanor was calm, professional, reassuring in exactly the way the congregation needed to be reassured. Angelo didn't trust him, not because of anything Sam Haynes said or did, because Angelo could smell him. And beneath the surface scent of soap and diesel, and the chemical signature of a man who'd been driving for hours, there was something else. Something that Angelo's enhanced senses identified instantly, and his human mind took several minutes to catch up with. Sam Haynes wasn't afraid. Everyone in Calvary Hollow was afraid. It was the baseline emotion of the town, a low, constant hum of unease that Angelo could now detect as easily as he detected heartbeats. Every person who walked through the church doors carried the chemical markers of sustained low-grade alarm. Phil Hart, Eleanor Thomas, Lewis Cox with his military bearing and his talk of armed response. All of them operated on a foundation of carefully managed dread. Sam Haynes had none. 0. He stood in the church basement surrounded by frightened people and emitted the calm, neutral chemical signature of a man who was exactly where he expected to be, doing exactly what he intended to do. He wasn't brave. A bravery smells different. It has the sharp overlay of adrenaline being consciously overridden by will. Sam Haynes was simply unworried. And the only reason a stranger would be unworried in a town full of worried people was if the stranger already knew what was in the woods and wasn't threatened by it. Angelo watched him through the meeting, listened to him offer practical advice, motion-activated lights, livestock enclosures, coordinated patrol schedules, watched the congregation respond to him with the desperate gratitude of people being offered a solution by someone who sounded competent, watched Sam Haynes work the room with the patient efficiency of a man performing a role he'd performed many times before. After the meeting, Angelo followed him to the parking lot. "You're from the pack," Angelo said. Sam Haynes stopped walking, or turned. His expression didn't change. It had never changed, Angelo realized. The face had been set to helpful stranger from the moment he walked in, and the muscles hadn't shifted once. A mask. A very good one. "I'm here to observe," Sam said. His voice was different now, the folksy warmth stripped away, replaced by something flatter and more precise. "The Alpha wants to know how the transition is progressing. Tell him it's progressing." "I can see that." Sam's eyes moved over Angelo, not the polite, unfocused sweep of social interaction, but the detailed, diagnostic scan of something evaluating the progress of a process it understood intimately. "Your hands are different. Your posture has changed. Lower center of gravity, weight distributed for mobility rather than stability. And you identified me by scent before I'd been in the room 5 minutes." A pause. "You're ahead of schedule. Is that a problem?" "It means the wolf is finding less resistance than expected. You're not fighting it." Angelo looked at the woods beyond the parking lot. The dark spaces between the pines that he could now see into, not with clarity, but with a new kind of vision that worked on heat and motion rather than light. He could see 3 small animals moving through the underbrush 40 yards in, a rabbit, 2 mice. Their body heat glowed against the cold dark of the forest like embers. "I'm not fighting it because I agreed to it," Angelo said. I made a choice. Fighting the consequences of your own choice is just regret with extra steps. Sam Haines regarded him with an expression that Angelo recognized. Oh, because he'd seen it on the Alpha's face. Recognition, the specific recognition of someone who has watched many shepherds walk this road and is seeing something in this one that the others didn't have. The Alpha was right about you, Sam said. You're not doing this out of duty. You're doing it out of love. That's why the wolf is integrating so cleanly. It recognizes the love. It's the same love. Protect, guard, patrol, different language, same architecture. He got in his truck, drove away. Angelo stood in the parking lot and listened to the engine until it was a whisper on the edge of the county, and then he went inside and locked the doors and stood in the dark church and felt the wolf inside him settle against his consciousness like a large dog curling up at the foot of a bed, not hostile. Not invasive, present, patient, waiting for the man to finish what he needed to finish so the wolf could begin what it needed to begin. Nights 10 and 11, his memories began to reorganize, not disappear. The information was all still there, his mother's face, his seminary years, the morning he'd first felt the call to ministry, the 11 years of Calvary Hollow. But the emotional architecture around these memories was shifting. His mother's face, once a warm, immediate presence that he could summon at will and feel the full weight of the love attached to it, had become something more distant. Still loved, still known, but catalogued differently, filed in a section of his mind that was becoming less frequently accessed as the wolf's priorities restructured his cognitive landscape. The wolf didn't care about his mother. The wolf cared about the territory, about the flock, about the boundary and the patrol route and the sensory data streaming in from an increasingly vast perceptual field. The wolf's mind was practical, present tense, oriented toward the immediate and the tangible. Memories that didn't serve the function of protection were gently, firmly deprioritized, not deleted, but moved to a shelf that the wolf's attention rarely visited. Angelo fought this. Not physically. You can't physically fight a thought, but with the desperate, stubborn persistence of a man holding a door closed against a wind that doesn't tire. He made himself remember, forced himself to sit with the memories, to relive them, to feel the emotions attached to them with the full weight of human sentimentality. His mother teaching him to make bread, the flour on her hands, the way she hummed, the smell of the kitchen, which he could now reconstruct with olfactory precision so detailed it was almost a time machine. The exact chemical composition of that kitchen in 1982, available to his enhanced nose in a way his human memory could never have achieved. The wolf gave him better access to the data, it just didn't attach the same value to it. He caught himself growling on night 10, not at a person, at a noise. A car backfiring on Main Street at 11 p.m., a sudden explosive sound that his wolf brain interpreted as a threat to the territory before his human brain could intervene. The growl came from his chest, deep, resonant, vibrating through his rib cage with a power that rattled the dishes in the kitchen cabinet. It lasted 2 seconds. He clamped his jaw shut, pressed his hands to the counter, and breathed. 2 seconds. A 2-second lapse in which the wolf had taken the wheel and his human consciousness had been a passenger. It had happened so fast that the transition was seamless. No buffer, no warning, no conscious sensation of ceding control. Just a sound, a response, and the belated realization that the response had not been his. He stopped sleeping in the rectory after that. He moved to the woods. Not deep, just past the tree line behind the church property, where the canopy provided cover and the ground was soft with pine needles. He told himself it was precaution. If he shifted in his sleep, partially, involuntarily, it was better to be in the woods than in the house. But the truth was simpler. The rectory had stopped feeling like home. The woods felt right. The pine needles under his back. The cold air on his skin. The sounds of the forest. No longer alien, no longer separate, but native, a language he was beginning to speak. Night 12. The first partial shift came while he was asleep. He woke to find his hands changed. not wrapped in cloth. He'd stopped wrapping them, stopped bothering with the pretense, but genuinely, structurally different. The fingers were too long, the joints too numerous. The nails curved into something that could no longer be called nails. They were claws, small, incomplete, retracting slowly as he woke, and his human consciousness reasserted itself, but claws. His hands had become weapons while he slept. His eyes reflected light. He discovered this when he went to the rectory bathroom and turned on the light and caught his own reflection, and the reflection caught light back. A flash, gold. The same gold that Bobby Klein's eyes had become, that the graycoat's eyes carried, that the Alpha's gaze generated. Angelo's eyes, still brown in daylight, still human from the outside, now contained something behind them that lit up in the dark. He avoided mirrors after that. Night 13. He held one final night service. Wednesday evening, 17 people. He wore his vestments, the full set, cassock and surplice and stole, the ceremonial armor of his vocation. He wore them not because the service required it, but because he needed the weight, the physical reminder of what he was, pressed against the body that was becoming something else. His hands were hidden in the sleeves. The fingers were wrong tonight, too long, too jointed, tipped with nails that caught on the fabric. He gripped the lectern and felt the wood compress under a strength that the lectern had never been built to accommodate. He looked at his congregation. 17 faces. He knew everyone. He loved everyone. And he gave them the sermon about the Good Shepherd. He hadn't planned it. The words came from the place where his love was stored, the structural, architectural, 11-year accumulation that the wolf recognized, even if it couldn't name it. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, he said. That's what the scripture says, John 10:11, and we've always understood that to mean death. The ultimate sacrifice, a life ended for the sake of others, but I've been thinking about it differently lately. He paused. The 17 faces watched him. Eleanor Thomas in the front row, Lucia Bennett near the back, Phil Hart on the aisle, leaning forward, listening the way he listened when he sensed that what was being said mattered more than what was being heard. What if laying down his life doesn't mean dying? What if it means something harder? What if it means becoming something else? Something the sheep wouldn't recognize? What if the shepherd has to stop being a shepherd in the way the sheep understand, so that he can protect them in a way they'll never see? Silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of confusion, the profound silence of people receiving something they don't fully understand, but sense, on a level below language, is important. I think love does that sometimes, Angelo said. His voice was steady. His hands, hidden in the cloth, were shaking, not with emotion, but with the physical tremor of a body caught between forms. I think love asks you to change, not into something lesser, into something the person you love might not recognize. And the hardest part isn't the changing. The hardest part is knowing that the people you're changing for will never know why you did it. Eleanor Thomas was crying. Silently, without moving, the tears tracking down the lines of her 83-year-old face with the slow precision of water finding channels in ancient stone. She didn't wipe them. She sat and looked at him, and he understood, with a certainty that transcended his enhanced senses, that she knew. Not the specifics, not the pact or the graycoats or the transformation eating him alive, but the shape, the weight, the contour of what he was doing. She knew he was saying goodbye. He finished the service. The congregation filed out. Eleanor squeezed his hand as she passed, both his hands actually, taking them in her small, strong, 83-year-old grip, without flinching at the changed shape of his fingers beneath the cloth. You were a good shepherd, Angelo, she said. Present tense abandoned, past tense deliberate. He couldn't speak. He nodded. She released his hands, walked into the night, night 14, midnight. The church was empty. Angelo locked the doors, every door. Front, back, vestry, basement. He locked them not to keep something out, but to keep the moment contained, to preserve the sacredness of what was about to happen within walls that had been consecrated for exactly this purpose, the transformation of one thing into another. He put on his vestments, all of them, the full weight, cassock, alb, stole, chasuble, the armor of his priesthood, were worn one final time, not in service to a congregation, but in service to a farewell. He lit the candles, every one, the altar candles, the sanctuary lamp, the votives that lined the side chapel, the church filled with warm, unsteady light, the light of 100 small flames, each one a prayer that someone had lit at some point in the past 115 years. The light moved on the stone walls. It made the shadows breathe. He stood at the altar, placed the bread on the paten, poured the wine into the chalice, and he said Mass, alone, for himself, a funeral for the man he was, performed by the man himself, in the church he had given his life to. He said the words he'd said 1,000 times, the liturgy of the Eucharist, the ancient, rhythmic, deeply familiar incantation that he could perform in his sleep and had occasionally, when exhaustion and devotion blurred the line between consciousness and prayer. He said the words and he meant them, every syllable, every gesture, every prescribed motion of the rite that transformed bread into body and wine into blood. He reached the consecration, the central mystery, the moment when the priest lifts the host and speaks the words of Christ, "This is my body, which will be given up for you," and the bread becomes something else. Something that looks the same but is changed, transformed at a level that the eye cannot detect but the soul recognizes. He lifted the bread. He spoke the words, "This is my body, which will be given up for you." And the wolf, which had been patient, which had been waiting, which had been growing inside him for 13 nights with the steady inevitability of a tide, consumed what remained. It was not gentle. The sound his body made as it came apart was not a human sound. Bone cracking, cartilage tearing, muscle fibers shredding and reweaving in configurations that the human skeleton was never meant to accommodate. His vestments split along the seams, the cassock tearing down the back, the alb shredding, the stole falling to the altar in 2 pieces as his shoulders widened and his spine restructured and his neck thickened and his skull reshaped itself around a brain that was no longer entirely his. His last human sound was not a scream, it was a word. Amen. Then the howl, rising from a throat that had just finished rebuilding itself, filling the church from stone wall to stone wall, pouring through the stained glass and the locked doors and the cracks in the century-old mortar, spilling out into the night above Calvary Hollow like a bell that had been cast in grief and rung with love. Every person in the town heard it, in their beds, in their kitchens, in the dark spaces between sleep and waking. They heard it and they incorporated it into their dreams, as wind, as thunder, as the distant, indefinable cry of something they would never be able to name. When it was over, a wolf stood at the altar of St. Matthias Church, enormous, dark-furred, broad through the chest and shoulder, built on a scale that suggested the body it had consumed had been substantial. Its eyes were gold, deep, liquid, luminous, and they looked out at the empty pews with an expression that should not have been possible on an animal's face. Grief, recognition, love. The wolf stood where the priest had stood, eyes surrounded by the shredded remains of holy vestments, in a church lit by 100 candles. It looked at the altar, at the bread on the paten, unchanged, the consecration interrupted, the transformation of the bread halted by the transformation of the priest, at the wine in the chalice, untouched. It lowered its massive head, touched its nose to the altar cloth, breathed in the scent of the wood, the wax, the incense that had saturated the stone over a century of services. Then it lifted its head and howled once more, softer this time, not for the town, for the building, for the altar, for the 115 years of prayers that had soaked into the stone and would remain there long after the wolf was gone. It turned, walked down the center aisle, the same aisle the graycoats had walked when they came to demonstrate their reach, and past the pews with their hidden letters, past the sanctuary lamp, still burning, through the door that it opened with a paw that had learned the mechanism from a hand that no longer existed, into the night, into the woods, into a life that would be spent at the boundary between the world that had made him and the world that had claimed him, ensuring that the pact held, that the flock slept safely, that the sacrifice meant something even if no one ever knew it was made. The candles on the altar burned until dawn. Nobody came to blow them out. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. The first person to notice was Lucia Bennett. She arrived at the church at 6:30 on Thursday morning, as she did every week, to set up the food bank in the basement. She had the key Angelo had given her years ago, one of only 3 copies in existence, the others belonging to Eleanor Thomas and Phil Hart. She unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and stopped. The candles were out, not blown out, burned down, every one of them. Puddles of cooled wax pooled on the altar, the side tables, the votive racks. The church smelled of spent wax and something else, something wild, something organic, something that Lucia's conscious mind couldn't identify, but her body recognized with a jolt of adrenaline that made her take a step backward before she understood why. The vestments were on the altar, or what remained of them. The cassock lay in 2 pieces, split down the back along a seam that hadn't torn. It had been forced apart from the inside. The alb was shredded. The stole lay in 2 halves across the altar cloth, separated at the exact midpoint, as if something had grown through it. The chasuble was in ribbons. The bread on the paten was untouched. The wine in the chalice was full. Lucia set down the box of canned goods she was carrying, walked to the rectory, knocked on the door. No answer. She tried the handle, unlocked, as always. The rectory was empty. The bed was made. The kitchen was clean. The small wooden crucifix hung on the wall above the kitchen table. And on the nightstand beside the bed, Father Angelo Gillespie's Bible sat open to John 10:11. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. Lucia called Eleanor Thomas. Eleanor called Phil Hart. Phil called the sheriff's office. Within 2 hours, every remaining member of the congregation knew that Father Angelo was gone. His possessions were in order. His finances were settled. The church accounts balanced, the utility bills prepaid through the end of the quarter. His personal effects were minimal and neatly arranged. Clothing in the closet, books on the shelf, the small collection of objects that constituted the material evidence of a life devoted almost entirely to other people. Nothing was missing except the man himself. No note, no letter of resignation, no forwarding address, no indication of where he had gone or why or whether he intended to return. The sheriff's deputy, the same one who had written up Derek Sullivan's fence as vandalism, likely juveniles, took a report. Missing person, male, 47, last seen Wednesday evening at the night service, no signs of struggle, no signs of foul play. The deputy noted the destroyed vestments on the altar but did not include them in the report because he could not think of a category they belonged in. The diocese was notified. A bishop's representative called the following week, spoke with Phil Hart and Eleanor Thomas, and expressed concern and condolence in the measured institutional language of an organization that processes the disappearances of clergy with more frequency than it publicly acknowledges. Father Gillespie's file was updated. Departed under unclear circumstances. A temporary replacement was promised. The wheels of ecclesiastical bureaucracy turned slowly and without traction. The letters were found on Sunday. It was Eleanor Thomas who found the first one. She sat in her usual seat, front row, right side, and reached for the hymnal, and the envelope fell into her lap. Her name was on the front, in handwriting she recognized immediately, Angelo's precise, careful script, though something about the later strokes was different, rougher, more angular, as if the hand that wrote them had been under strain. She opened it, read it, and sat very still for a very long time. Around her, the same discovery was happening in every pew, envelopes sliding from hymnals, names in familiar handwriting, 30 letters for 30 people, some addressed to parishioners who had already left, whose letters would be mailed by those who remained. Each one personal, each one specific, each one containing the things that Father Angelo Gillespie had meant to say over 11 years and had kept saving for later because there was always supposed to be more time. The church was silent as 30 letters were read. Not the silence of an empty room, the silence of a room full of people simultaneously encountering the same realization, that the man who had shepherded them for over a decade had known he was leaving, had prepared for it, had taken the time, in whatever crisis or decision had consumed his final days, to sit down and write to each of them individually, to leave behind the specific words that each specific person needed to hear. Phil Hart read his letter and wept. He had not wept in the church in 6 years, not since the sin he'd confessed and never forgiven himself for. Angelo's letter addressed that sin directly, by name, with a gentleness and a precision that could only have come from a man who had carried the knowledge of it for 6 years and had chosen, in his final days, to set it down in writing so that Phil could finally set it down too. Gladys Ryan read hers and laughed, a short, sharp bark of laughter that broke the silence and drew every eye. She looked up from the page, her 71-year-old face cracked into an expression that was equal parts grief and satisfaction, and said, "The man called me the bravest person he ever met. Took him 11 years to say it to my face, and he still couldn't do it in person." She folded the letter carefully, put it in her coat pocket. Typical. Jean Lawrence read hers and pressed it to her chest. She was sitting beside Bobby, whose gold eyes moved across his own letter, the letter Angelo had written to him, not to the Bobby he'd been before, but to whatever Bobby was becoming, with an expression that Jean couldn't read and didn't try to. Lucia Bennett read hers and looked at the back door of the church. The letter mentioned the door, the unlocked door, the act of grace she'd performed in secret for years, opening her diner to anyone who needed shelter without ever telling a soul. Angelo had known. He'd known for years. And he'd kept the secret, honoring her privacy, until the very end, when he'd written it down not to expose her but to tell her that it mattered, that he'd seen it, that God had seen it. Eleanor Thomas read hers last. She'd been holding it, unopened, watching the others. Now when the room was quiet, when every letter had been read, and every face was wet, and every pew held someone grappling with the specific, devastating weight of being known and loved and left, she opened the envelope. The letter was short, shorter than the others. The handwriting in the final lines was barely legible, the strokes elongated, the pressure uneven, as if the hand holding the pen had been in the process of becoming something that could no longer hold a pen. She read it, folded it, placed it in her purse, and when Lucia Bennett asked her later what it said, Eleanor Thomas, 83 years old, iron-willed, a woman who had survived everything, looked at her with steady eyes and said, "He said he was sorry he couldn't stay, and he said the shepherd never really leaves. He just changes pastures." The attack stopped. Completely. Overnight. As if a switch had been thrown, as if the thing that had been tightening its circle around Calvary Hollow for months had simply retracted, pulled back into the woods, dissolved into the dark spaces between the trees, and gone still. Edgar Pitts's cattle grazed undisturbed. Derek Sullivan's fences stood intact. Renee Daniels' children's windows remained unmarked. The gold eyes vanished from the tree line. The subsonic vibrations that had made dogs cower and livestock flee ceased entirely, as if the frequency had been switched off at the source. Bobby Klein's eyes remained gold, but the wildness in them, the untethered, translating quality that Jean had described, settled, stabilized. He was still Bobby and not Bobby, still the man she'd married wearing a layer of something she couldn't name. But whatever had been pulling him toward the woods had released its grip. He stayed. He worked. He held his wife's hand with fingers that were still his own, and if the grip was sometimes stronger than a mechanic's grip should be, Jean didn't mention it. Nobody connected the two events. The priest's disappearance and the end of the attacks existed in the town's collective memory as two separate mysteries, one sad, one relieving, filed in different drawers, never cross-referenced, never examined side by side. This was not stupidity, it was the survival mechanism of a community that had been pushed to the edge of what it could accommodate and had chosen, unconsciously and collectively, to step back from that edge rather than look over it. Life resumed. Not the same life. The population had dropped, the scars remained. The empty houses on the outskirts stood as monuments to the families that had left, but the remaining residents of Calvary Hollow did what remaining residents of small towns have always done. They stayed. They rebuilt. They went to church on Sunday and put money in the plate and sang hymns that echoed off stone walls that were older than any of them and would outlast all of them. A new priest arrived in the spring, young, recently ordained, assigned to St. Matthias with the same administrative indifference that had sent Angelo 11 years earlier, a small parish, a remote location, a posting that was either a test or a punishment, and that the young man accepted with the nervous enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned to distinguish between the two. But there were signs, for those who looked. A wolf was seen on the ridge above the church, not every day, not on a schedule anyone could predict, but regularly enough that the sightings accumulated in the town's awareness the way rain accumulates in a barrel, slowly, drop by drop, until one day you look and the barrel is full. The wolf was enormous, dark-furred, larger than any wolf the hill country had produced in recorded memory. It sat at the tree line, usually at dusk, usually on Sundays, and it watched the church with an attention that every witness described the same way. It was listening, head slightly tilted, ears forward, body perfectly still. Listening to the service it could no longer attend, in a building it could no longer enter, for people it could no longer speak to. It never approached. It never threatened. It sat and it listened, and when the service ended and the congregation filed out and the lights were turned off, it stood, turned, and disappeared into the woods with a silence that something that large should not have been capable of. 17 separate witnesses reported the wolf over the following years. The reports were consistent: the size, the color, the behavior, the golden eyes that caught the last light of the day and held it. Children reported a wolf that walked beside them on the road to school, not close, 50 yards back, just present, keeping pace. Their parents told them it was a stray dog, and the children accepted this explanation the way children accept all adult explanations, with outward compliance and private certainty that the adults were wrong. The wolf wasn't a dog. The wolf walked the way Father Angelo used to walk, steady, unhurried, with the easy, purposeful gait of someone who knows exactly where he's going and has all the time in the world to get there. Eleanor Thomas began leaving bread and wine at the tree line every Thursday evening. She never explained why. When asked, and she was asked many times by many people, she simply said, "The shepherd needs to eat." She said it the way she said everything, with the iron certainty of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and a century's worth of nonsense, and was not going to waste her remaining time explaining herself to people who hadn't earned the explanation. She continued the practice until she died at 89 in her sleep on a Tuesday in April, peaceful, expected. The kind of death that people call a blessing, because the alternative is so much worse. The morning after her funeral, Lucia Bennett went to the tree line. She found the last offering Eleanor had left: bread, wine, arranged on a flat stone with the careful precision of a woman performing a sacrament, untouched. Beside it, in the soft earth, a single paw print, larger than any dog, pressed deep, as if the animal had stood there for a long time, looking at the offering, deciding whether the ritual still held now that the hands that performed it were gone. Lucia left her own offering the following Thursday: bread from the diner, wine from the bottle she kept in the back for cooking. She placed them on Eleanor's stone and stood there in the dusk and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. By morning, the offering was gone. Lucia continued the practice every Thursday. She never missed a week. From the tape.
If you're listening to this, I need you to know 3 things. First, the pact is real. The pact is real. What I did was necessary. I reviewed every option. I prayed for alternatives. None came. This was the only door, and I walked through it with my eyes open. Second, I don't regret it. I thought I would. I thought the wolf would eat my love for them along with everything else. It didn't. The love is different now. Less verbal, more gravitational. Less, I care about you, and more, I would stand between you and anything that moves in the dark. But it's the same love. I'm certain of that. Third, I am still a priest. I know how that sounds. I know the church would disagree. I know there's no canon law for a clergyman who becomes a wolf. But ordination isn't a coat you take off. It's a mark on the soul. And my soul, whatever shape my body takes, still belongs to God. I believe that. I have to believe that. Because if God doesn't recognize me anymore, then everything I did was just a man destroying himself for nothing. And I can't live with that. I'd rather live as a wolf who still prays than a man who stopped believing. Tell them I loved them. Everyone. Tell them the shepherd never really leaves. He just changes pastures.
Epilogue: The Wolf on the Ridge. Years passed. The stone of St. Matthias grew older. The congregation grew smaller, then stabilized, then slowly, cautiously, grew again. New families moved in. Children were born. The town didn't return to what it had been, but it became something else. Something that had survived a season of darkness and emerged into light that felt earned rather than given. Every new priest assigned to the parish was told two things by the older parishioners. The instructions were delivered quietly, matter-of-factly, with the casual authority of people passing along information that had been tested by experience and verified by time. First, don't go into the woods after dark, not because it's dangerous, because whatever is out there deserves its privacy. Second, if you ever see a large wolf sitting at the tree line on a Sunday evening, don't be alarmed. Don't approach. Just continue the service. He's listening. A Sunday evening, late summer, the light coming through the stained glass in long, honey-colored beams that turned the dust motes into constellations. The new priest, young, earnest, freshly assigned to a parish he didn't yet understand, stood at the altar delivering his homily to a congregation of 19 people. He was finding his footing, learning the names, discovering the rhythms of a community that operated on traditions he hadn't been briefed on and histories he hadn't been told. He was mid-sentence when he glanced at the window. The wolf was there, at the tree line, sitting in the last light of the day, its dark fur catching the amber of the sunset. Its golden eyes fixed on the church with an attention so complete and so still that it didn't look like watching. It looked like worship. The young priest faltered, lost his place, stared. In the front pew, right side, the seat that had belonged to Eleanor Thomas and that Lucia Bennett had occupied since Eleanor's death, Lucia caught the young priest's eye. She smiled, not a smile of reassurance, a smile of knowledge, the smile of a woman who had been leaving bread and wine at the tree line for years and had never once questioned why. After the service, as the congregation filed out, the young priest approached Lucia. His face held the expression of a man who has seen something he cannot categorize and is hoping for context. "The wolf," he said, "at the tree line. What, who?" Lucia looked at the window. The wolf was gone. When the tree line was empty, the last light was fading behind the ridge, turning the sky the color of old gold. "The shepherd," she said, "the one who never left." The young priest opened his mouth to ask another question. Lucia shook her head, gently, not dismissively, protectively, the way you protect a story that belongs to someone else, the way you guard a secret that isn't yours to tell, but is yours to keep. "Just continue the service, Father," she said. "He only stays when he approves." She walked out into the evening. The young priest stood in the doorway of St. Matthias Church and watched her go, and then he looked at the tree line one more time. Empty. Dark. the woods holding their breath the way woods do when something large and watchful has just decided to let the silence speak for itself. He went back inside, closed the doors, and straightened the hymnals, and as he moved through the pews, his hand brushed something tucked into the hymnal in the front row, right side. An envelope, old, yellowed with time, a name written on the front in handwriting he didn't recognize, angular, strained, the writing of a hand that had been in the process of becoming something else. The name on the envelope was not his, it was Eleanor's, but beneath it, in a different pen, in Lucia's handwriting, a note had been added, "For the next shepherd. When he's ready." The young priest held the envelope, looked at the door, looked at the window, where the last trace of golden light was fading from the ridge. He wasn't ready. Not yet. But he put the envelope in his pocket. And on Thursday evening, without understanding why, he walked to the tree line behind the church and left a piece of bread and a small cup of wine on the flat stone he found there, worn smooth by years of offerings, by the patient, faithful repetition of a ritual that had no liturgy and no congregation and no priest, just a shepherd and a flock that remembered. By morning, the offering was gone. St. Matthias Church still operates to this day. The tape was found. The letters were read. The wolf on the ridge has been reported by 17 separate witnesses over the years since Father Gillespie's disappearance. No formal investigation has ever been opened. Father Angelo Gillespie's file with the diocese lists him as departed under unclear circumstances. His vestments were never recovered. His Bible remains on the nightstand in the priest's quarters, still open to John 10:11. And every Thursday evening, someone in Calvary Hollow still leaves bread and wine at the tree line. No one has ever seen who takes it, but by morning, it's always gone. Dear viewers, as we come to the end of Father Angelo's story, I want to leave you with the question that he carried into the woods and never got to ask out loud. If loving someone meant you had to become something they'd never recognize, would you still do it? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, if the wolf on the ridge is still sitting in the back of your mind, that like button is right there. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to this channel. We'll see you in the next one.